Hello, and welcome to Victorian naval diplomacy, which is, of course, today's topic. I know it's not technically what I've written today's title as, because, well, there are lots of options, and we're looking at some specifications, but it is pretty much Victorian naval diplomacy what we're looking at, and I have used three main books in assessing this. Admirals by Andrew Lambert, Robert K. Massey, and as Robert K. Massey's Dreadnought, and Gunboat Diplomacy by Cable. I've also had some very nice journal articles which have assisted me, which are the Alexandria Massacre, 11th of June 1982, and the British Occupation of Egypt by M.E. Chamberlain, which was in 1977, in the Middle Eastern Journal of Middle Eastern Studies. Britain and the Russo-Turkish War of 1768 to 74 by M.S. Anderson, the English Historical Review, January 1954. And the International Significance of British Naval Missions to the Ottoman Empire, 1908 to 1914, by Chris Bree Rooney, in Middle Eastern Studies again, but in 1998 this time. It's amazing that most of the very good naval diplomacy journals articles seem to be published before about no. They're either good. They're either before 1980 or after about 1997. I don't know what it is, but there's about 27 years when naval diplomacy seems to fall out of fashion. No, 17 years. Sorry. Bad maths. Anyway, let's get into this, shall we? So, what is naval diplomacy and gunboat diplomacy? The use of threat of limited naval force otherwise than as an act of war in order to secure advantage or to avert loss, either in the furtherance of an international dispute or else against foreign nationals within the territory or the jurisdiction of their own state. When you launch a Tomahawk cruise missile strike from a ship against land targets in a state other than your own, that's naval diplomacy. When you send aircraft over from an aircraft carrier, naval diplomacy. When you land Marines, naval diplomacy. Even if they're not shooting, if they're doing anything from the sea, that is naval diplomacy and gunboat diplomacy to an extent. Fun ones to have, eh? Very encompassing. But this does mean you get a rather wide margin of what's included, and also a rather wide margin of what can happen. Now, the first event we're going to be looking at is Constantinople of 1877. And this is a rather interesting one, which mostly I rely actually on Andrew Lambert's Admirals for, because Geoffrey Hornby has such fun. Right then, let's see. Back in London, the cabinet was in turmoil. In his anxiety to preserve peace, Lord Derby placed a wholly unwarranted faith in Russian assurances. Prime Minister Disraeli favoured more belligerent solutions, pushed on by the Queen and the significant elements of public opinion. Disraeli's unofficial correspondence with Layard only added to the confusion in Istanbul and on board the Alexandria. On 23rd January, the cabinet ordered the fleet to enter the Straits, aware that Derby would resign. On the 24th, they reversed their position when news arrived that the Sultan had accepted peace proposals from Russia. The sudden reversal policy demoralized the Turks, who had anticipated British support, and encouraged the Russians, who feared the arrival of the fleet. It left Britain looking irresolute and incompetent, especially when the policy was reversed once more on the 9th of February. In effect, the Russians had bamboozled the cabinet by holding out vague promises. The contrast between a clear and certain statement conveyed by the movement of the fleet and this honest wordplay of Russian ministers had escaped Derby, who did not share his cousin's concern for simplicity and clarity. When Layard telegraphed that the Russians had occupied Istanbul, opposition to active measures collapsed, both in the cabinet and on the floor of the House of Commons. Layard's communication was erroneous, though perhaps deliberately so. The Russians never occupied the city. On 8th of February, the government secured a large vote of credit to fund preparations for war and ordered Hornby to enter the Straits, ostensibly to protect British life and property. It was late in the day for such movements to have any effect, and Layard telegraphed home to oppose the attempt. Predictably, the arrival of the fleet alarmed the Russians. Grand Duke Nicholas demanded that if the Turkish fleet was not surrendered, he would occupy Istanbul, but his demand was curtly rejected by the Sultan. The Russians were in no position to make such demands, since their troops were still 12 miles short of the lines of Belair, where the Turks were reinforcing the fences. Leaving Cornell with two battleships to watch the lines, Hornby sent the Salamis to open telegraph links with London and a brief and the ambassador. He followed with four battleships the next day. 15th of February, with front line at San Stefano, the Turks still held Istanbul. Ever since the fall of the Byzantine Empire, Russian rulers had dreamt of restoring the city to Orthodox Christianity, or reconsecrating the Hagia Sophia, and of making themselves masters of the strategic hub of Eurasian landmass. But with Hornby's fleet on the Bosphorus, the Russians did not dare seize the greatest prize that army had ever laid eyes on. They had good reason to, not to move. While Hornby's four ships represented the Mediterranean fleet, the Channel fleet had been ordered to Malta, and a third fleet was mobilizing to attack St. Petersburg. Once the right arm of the British Empire flexed, Russia was paralyzed. For all her military power and vast lands, Russia cannot compete with British naval, economic, and industrial power. Having secured the Belair lines and replaced the local governor with a more reliable officer, Hornby could support any diplomatic demands the government chose to make. That's Andrew Lambert. This is, in many ways, classic naval diplomacy. And again, Hornby doesn't make massive demands for a fleet. It's rather interesting. He reminds me of previous admirals we've looked at. He reminds me, he basically goes, if we are to have war and you think war's likely, I would like a certain rear admiral sent out to me with a couple more battleships. I don't need a massive fleet sent out to me, but I do need a second in command. And I want it to be the one of my choosing. And that's what he does. That's his flagship. This is the ironclad age. This is naval diplomacy, which is really king at this point. And he has to deter Russia. It's interesting to note the naval officer, in many ways, is acting the far stronger diplomat than the diplomat. Layard is... He's noted historian, archaeologist, he's very good, but he is not perhaps the correct temperament for the post he's been found in. Suited in many, many other ways for the post, but in temperament for dealing with Russian aggression, these things, he does seem to enjoy intrigues, jumping the gun, and imagining himself guiding the scenario 6 to 7 moves ahead. When really you want a diplomat who's going to send back the information, preferably to through the official channels, as well as not directly to Disraeli. You have Lord Derby, who is... Well, Lord Derby sounds to me as he would be quite good at modern diplomacy, and that so much is placed on words and words and words of people. The trouble is he'd probably find himself falling in the same problem, in that words on paper are as only good as the ability to enforce them. And if the other person doesn't think you have any ability or will to enforce them, and they think they can get away without doing them, then why would they bother? And that's ultimately what you have going on here. Why would they bother? Russia had its eyes on a great prize, a Russia with control of Constantinople. That's a very different Russia to deal with for Britain. And that's a Russia which completely controls the Black Sea. It already is very powerful now, but a Russia which controls Constantinople, which controls a portion or the whole of the Straits of the Dardanelles. And let's be honest, if they got Constantinople, they could probably have pushed down to take at least the European side of the Straits of Dardanelles. So they'd have had one side of the coast. Is a Russia which is far more economically powerful than it has been previously. Although, honestly, it's also Russia which would be far more exposed than it had been. Yes, there's a lot to gain, but there's also a lot to lose. But it's successful on this occasion. Why? Well, a strong fleet sent in and Russia can't compete with it. Doesn't always go so straightforward. Bombardment of Alexandria. So, this is the problem with Egypt. And the Suez Canal and all sorts of things. This is under Gladstone, who is a very good Prime Minister. And I listed all the captains because, although strange enough, Bergkamp Seymour's flag captain is quite difficult to pick out who exactly he is. Well, he has been for me. I might be missing a very obvious source. I have been, as I do admit, I have been having weird things going on recently, so I could have, in some sort of way, managed to miss that, but I haven't been able to find it so far. Alexandria is not a nice operation. No. It's understandable, in that the logic of the time goes, our private citizens can go anywhere they want. It's Pax Britannia. They're being attacked. It might be a false flag operation by the Sultan. It might not. We don't know. They're being attacked. We send a fleet there to restore stability to the situation. The people who are rebelling to an extent against the Sultan are given orders, stop building your forts up or we will consider it a threat to the fleet. They continue building their forts up. The fleet opens fire. The fleet does get damaged. A little bit. But not that much. And you have Sultan and Alexandra pictured at the front of this picture, but Alexandra isn't the flag captain at this point, which is the interesting thing. As I said, there is a debate as to whether Hotham is definitely stays aboard Alexandra. We're fairly sure. But there's also a report that he's with Seymour during the battle. And Seymour is definitely aboard Invincible because Seymour picks Invincible because she's shallow and can get closer in, and he can better direct the fire because he wants to try and minimize damage to private property. Now, before you start thinking this is because he doesn't wants to minimize damage to people, it's not because he's worried about the various Egyptians wandering around. Please don't start putting modern perceptions onto him. And it's not bad because his view is those people are in rebellion against their sultan and they're currently threatening European life and, more importantly, not European but British lives, and therefore he's perfectly justified in what he's doing. But what it's more about is that the fighting, the idea that he can control and stop it damaging the property of those Europeans and the British and Americans. Interesting enough, there's a French force which turns up but doesn't take part in the bombardment, and there's an American force there which also doesn't take part in bombardment, but they all sort of turn up to watch because they all send ships because of the incident that's been going on in Alexandria. They're all there because of the threats to life and liberty there going on to their people who are over there. And this is the age of might is right. That's what's going on. And to be honest, Alexandria does have defenses which, in theory, on paper, stand a chance against the fleet. They actually don't, because that fleet is very, very well trained. You have Inflexible, which is under the command of John Arbuthnot Fisher, future First Sea Lord, guy who comes up with Dreadnought. He has trained his ship to a very, very high level. You have Seymour, who is one of the better admirals of his age. Definitely. You even have Lord Charles Beresford in charge of Condor. A little sort of interesting enough gunboat gunships come into play this way. We talk about gunboat diplomacy, but what I would honestly call sloops, really. Few guns, smaller ship, potters along. Main job is naval diplomacy and policing in these sort of areas. It's a fun thing. Let's see. Let's get the bombardment a little. There's another quote in. Hang on. Ah, there it is. Mm-hmm. Right then. So, ah, Free British and Free French ironclads arrived on Alexandria on the 20th of May in 1882. The French Minister of Marine, Admiral Jean Boulier, knew Alexandria and was under no illusion from the beginning that their only function could be as a deterrent. The British learnt the lesson more slowly and painfully. Because of a rocky bar, only comparatively small ships could enter the harbour and be vulnerable to shore batteries. They were unlikely to be able to bring effective aid to a European's ashore in the event of trouble because of the configuration of the town. The ships were anchored in the western harbour. The European quarters of the town fronted on the eastern harbour. Between the two lay a maze of narrow streets, the Arab part of Alexandria. The western harbour itself was bordered by an almost continuous shantytown of poor Arab dwellings. The eastern, the so-called New Harbour, was accessible only to shallow draft fishing vessels. On the evening of the 11th of June, when the British consulate was believed to be in immediate danger, Captain Ward tried to bring HMS Semur into the eastern harbour, taking soundings every few yards, incidentally convincing the Egyptians that an invasion was imminent, but gave up as soon as he was reassured about the safety of the consulate. There is no doubt that from the time of their arrival in May, the presence of the warships was a major irritant without being an effective protection. In addition to the British and French ships, there were two Greek warships, the King George and the Hellas, in the western harbour. The British and the French had done their best to dissuade the Greeks from sending them, but Greeks not only had many nationals in Alexandria, but they could never resist any blow at the crumbling fabric of the Ottoman Empire, which may ultimately result in the restoration of more Turkish-held territory in the Balkans to Greece. It is hardly surprising that the people of Alexandria were in highly excited state of mind and began to utter those vague threats against the Christians in their midst, which were to sound so sinister when recounted after the 11th of June. In turn, Christians began to look to their own defence. Pistols and revolvers were imported from Greece, and it was alleged arms were also supplied from the British fleet for the defence of British families. Some of the foreign consuls in Alexandria threw themselves into this with a will. The moving spirit seems to have been the Swedish consul M. Bochter, with the enthusiastic support of the commanders of the British and Greek fleets. The Italian and Austrian consuls, however, were cautious and refused to act without the authority of their consul generals in Cairo. On 10th of June, Bochter went to Cairo to see the consuls general. They immediately disassociated themselves from the movement. Mallet telegraphed to Charles Cookson, the British consul in Alexandria, on the morning of 11th of June, telling him to have nothing to do with it. The plan for arming 3,000 to 4,000 persons was a most dangerous course and likely at any moment to exhaust cause of collision. But since the plan was in part already publicly known, Mallet feared that a sudden reversal of policy might in itself be dangerous, and he instructed Cookson to keep these orders confidential. There's all sorts of intrigue going on. Alexandria, it's the crumbling Ottoman Empire in a part, but it's also the Alexandria is itself a hotbed. It's so much poverty and so much disparity in quality of life. So close to each other. It always causes trouble. And again, there is a bit of. It ends up with this bombardment, which to an extent is successful. But because of the confused diplomatic messages being sent, the fleet can't achieve the same. And also, the reality is the ships that could be sent, they were. You didn't have viable forces ready to come in short and come in close enough. Hence, the bombardment takes place. It's one of the interesting things is, for naval diplomacy, you want to get in really, really close, really, really visible. That's how you have an impact. If you can't come in and have an impact, and if you can't come in quickly and have an impact, so you look like you're half-heartedly doing it, you can actually cause more trouble. It's like with all diplomacy. If you look like you're vacillating, you can cause far more complications than if you look firm and resolved. And this is the classic example here. And Tangiers and Algiers conference. Okay. So basically, you have Morocco. And Morocco is a lovely place, but it is falling apart. It's another symptom, to an extent, of something being perceived on lines of the Ottoman Empire, but Morocco is being perceived as also falling apart. It's rulers having trouble, poor economy combined with not really the most effective rulers always, or rather not the most effective means of implementing their rules as well, gave them a lot of issues. So France makes a play for Morocco. It's the age of empire. It's going to happen. Germany doesn't like this. Particularly the Kaiser doesn't like it, who decides to land at Tangiers while he's on a Mediterranean cruise and make a massive proclamation about German involvement. He's also seeing this as a way of trying to wind up and break up the Entente Cordiale. It doesn't work. For starters, he calls for a conference. The conference is to be held in Spain. It ends up being agreed to be held in Spain at Algeciras. Okay. And as you can see, if you look at this lovely picture of Algeciras, it's on the extreme left of the screen. You'll notice that in the middle of that bay, there is this very large prominent rock, which is Gibraltar. You can almost guess what's going to happen, thanks to the quote next to me from Massey. They hold the conference. And the Germans are very strong, very committed, very purposeful. They're browbeating everyone. They're trying to cause division between the British and the French and use the Americans to wind it all up and get everything. And Nichols sends a message. I need help. This is going to be causing trouble. This conference isn't going like it's supposed to be going. The Germans are being very rude, and we've got a problem here. The French are looking weak. And the British have been prepared for this. The Mediterranean and Atlantic fleets have been combining on a combined exercise not that far away. And on the night of the 28th of February, they come in. So on the 1st of March, when the diplomats all look out from their hotel windows, because of course they've all got the fancy hotels and the best accommodations, looking out over the beautiful bay. In front of them is the combined might of the Royal Navy's two largest fleets, rowed out in full strength, in full glorious white, under Admiral Lord Charles Beresford, the great sailor of his age. And they sit there and going, okay, this could be a problem. And then, of course, please come to dinner. Please come to dinner. Let me show you around my ships. Then when you're going back, we're going to fly all our searchlights up in the air and make ourselves look even bigger. This is a huge statement of power. After that point, the German threats of war, which they've been using to try and browbeat everyone, their imperial standing was... It has consequences, though. It causes another naval act to be passed in Germany. It accelerates the naval race between Britain and Germany. it forces Britain even more into the Anglo-French, the Entente Cordiale, the alliance. Germany, they had sought this as a moment to divide, end up being, to an extent, humiliated, shown that whilst you might have some sort of great power status, you are not the greatest power by a long way. This is one of those incidents, and all these incidents are what lead to what we've got today. What happened and what we've got today, because that's the joy of naval diplomacy. It is cumulative. Summary. So these are the people who are signing it in 1906. That decision in Algiers, but the decision was made. So the treaty was not made on diplomacy. The treaty was made on the Royal Navy showing up and going back down, because the Germans had been winning the diplomatic fight, had been managing to get pretty much everyone to try and fall in line with them on their threats of war, because no one wanted war. No one wanted a grand European war. They knew how dangerous and how deadly it could be. They knew the might of industry that was going to be deployed. But the threat of war sounds hollow when you have the imminent statement of what war looks like sitting across the bay from you. You might threaten and posture, but that's real intent. Words versus visible presence. And that was what naval diplomacy was in this time. So, bonus. And this is a little bit of a bonus, but here it is. There has been, going around, a quote drawn from from Napoleon, which basically says that sea power is to be a naval officer. All you have to be is a sort of a navigator, and that's the only art you need. And the art of land warfare is far more complicated. The interesting thing is that is a very much abridged quote, a massively abridged quote from this page in here in the history of the captivity of Napoleon. And it basically goes like this. The commander-in-chief of a naval army and the commander-in-chief of a land army are men who require different qualities. The qualities which fit a man to command a land army are born with him, while on the contrary, those necessary for commanding a naval army are easy to be acquired by experience. And it goes on. They haven't changed the tone or the phrase by the abridgment, but they have changed the full quantity and quality of what Napoleon says. And frankly, the abridgment makes him look far smarter than he actually is. Because when you go through it, he gets really, really silly. Basically, his argument comes down to that because ships can't hide, you don't need to understand artillery, and you don't need to understand anything, about other intelligence or anything. All you need is navigation to point yourself in the direction of the enemy, get there, and blast them to pieces. Naval diplomacy shows the fault of that. And frankly, the reality of naval war shows the fault of that. But it is rather interesting thinking that people who are in other ways considered quite intelligent and quite good can get quite so wrong. I would also add, though, this quote attributed to Napoleon isn't written by him. It's written by someone else who's writing down what he says Napoleon's saying. I'm not sure I trust it all 100%. But it's still a good quote because it points out what you need to be a good naval officer and a good land officer. And by default, a good air officer or a good space officer. So go and enjoy it. Thank you. You can find me in Twitter, Patreon, Global Maritime History. And thank you very much for watching. I hope to see you later at the live. Take care.